Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're going to really dive deep into the life and career of a very interesting historical figure.
Yes, definitely a figure shrouded in mystery,
Junio Valerio Borghese, also known as the Black Prince.
the Black Prince. Such an interesting name.
Yeah, he's a guy who kind of straddles this line between World War II and then the Cold War.
Right. Kind of operating in that gray area between the two.
Yeah, and leaves behind a ton of intrigue and questions in his wake.
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of unanswered questions.
And to guide us on this journey, we're going to be using excerpts from an article.
Okay, sounds good.
It's called Italy's Black Prince, Terror War Against the Nation State.
I've heard of that one.
And I think you might be wondering, what on earth connects
Right.
an Italian aristocrat, Nazi commandos, and, covert CIA operations?
All in one. Yeah.
Yeah, so buckle up because that's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Let's get into it.
So to start us off, who was this Black Prince? I mean, the name itself
Yeah.
just sounds, ominous.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like someone you wouldn't want to cross.
Right.
Well, the name, it fits, believe me. Junio Valerio Borghese. He came from this long line of Roman nobility.
Wow.
Yeah. Family that included popes and cardinals.
Really?
Yeah. But this particular Borghese, he was drawn to a very different kind of power.
I see.
Yeah, much more like military might. He was a very decorated naval officer. And he rose to prominence as the leader of Mussolini's elite ex-MAS frogman unit during World War II.
Frogmen.
Yeah.
So we're talking about underwater commandos here. What exactly were these guys doing?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well-
Underwater commandos. Think of them as the, Navy SEALs of their time. Highly skilled
Okay.
in underwater demolition, sabotage, stealth operations, that sort of thing.
So already we're dealing with a pretty elite unit here.
Right. And there's a twist. The ex-MAS unit wasn't your typical average, military outfit.
Right.
A lot of its officers, actually, including Borghese, they came from Italy's top aristocratic families.
Mhm.
We're talking princes and counts, fighting alongside each other.
So this was an elite squad in terms of skills, but also social standing.
Exactly.
What does that tell us about how they operated, do you think?
I think it definitely tells us that they had a level of autonomy and influence that most military units could only dream of. I mean, they even cultivated connections with companies,
Wow.
supplying them with weapons and equipment,
Wow.
suggesting this potential for covert operations, even during the war.
So even before World War II is over, we're seeing these guys operating with a degree of independence and secrecy.
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. What happened to Borghese and his frogmen when the tides started turning against the Axis powers?
Well, as you know, Italy switched sides in the war,
Yeah.
but Borghese, he remained fiercely loyal to Mussolini and to the fascist cause.
Wow.
Yeah, he and his ex-MAS unit actually engaged in some pretty brutal anti-partisan warfare. Yeah, and these actions would later on kind of paint him as a war criminal in the eyes of some.
Yeah, that's a pretty dark turn of events. So how does this decorated naval officer fighting for really a lost cause suddenly become this Black Prince of the Cold War?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. So Borghese was captured by the Allies,
Mm-hmm.
but instead of, facing a firing squad, like you might expect, he was actually arrested by American forces under the direction of, this is pretty interesting, a young OSS counterintelligence officer named James Jesus Angleton.
Angleton. Wait, are we talking about the James Angleton, the CIA?
That's the one.
Wow.
Yeah. And his involvement in Borghese's capture is anything but straightforward.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. Angleton was very deeply connected to British intelligence. And so it raises all sorts of questions about a hidden agenda behind Borghese's seemingly lucky escape from execution.
Okay, now we're getting into some serious spy thriller territory here. So we have a war hero turned fascist, captured by the Allies, but saved by a future CIA legend
Right.
who has ties to British intelligence. It's like a movie or something.
It really is. And remember, all of this is happening right at the dawn of the Cold War. Europe is in ruins, divided by ideology, on the brink of a potential nuclear showdown.
Yeah.
So in this context, figures like Borghese, with his military experience and his, very, very strong anti-communism,
Right.
they suddenly become really valuable assets.
So are we saying that Borghese, a man who was just fighting alongside the Nazis, is now being seen as a potential tool in the fight against communism?
That's exactly what we're saying, yeah. The Cold War created some very, very strange bedfellows.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, as the West sought to contain the Soviet Union, they were willing to work with former enemies, even those with a very questionable past.
I can see how that logic might work, but it's pretty chilling when you think about it. How did this play out in practice? Did Borghese become some kind of secret agent for the West?
Well, it wasn't quite that simple. What emerged in the post-war era was this concept of stay-behind armies.
Stay behind armies.
Yeah, these were secret anti-communist units established across Europe, often with the backing of NATO and Anglo-American intelligence.
So secret armies operating within the borders of supposedly friendly countries. That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It certainly had the potential to be. But the thinking at the time was that if the Soviets ever invaded Western Europe, these stay-behind units, they would be ready to resist from behind enemy lines, conducting sabotage, gathering intelligence, and generally making life difficult for the invading forces.
It's a pretty audacious strategy, and I'm guessing figures like Borghese and his former ex-MAS frogmen
Right.
were seen as kind of ideal recruits for these stay-behind armies.
Catching on quickly, yeah.
Yeah.
They had the experience, the skills, and perhaps most importantly, the ideological zeal to fight communism.
Mm-hmm.
There's a particular directive is called Operation Demagnetize.
Demagnetize.
Yeah, it was aimed at undermining communist parties in Italy and France, sometimes even against the will of their own governments.
So we're talking about covert operations being conducted within allied nations, potentially undermining democratically elected governments in the name of fighting communism.
That's the kind of unsettling reality of the Cold War.
Yeah.
Yeah, lines were blurred. And sometimes the memes justified the end, at least in the eyes of those who were orchestrating these operations.
Right.
And the British were very much involved too, by the way. Their Special Operations Executive, the SOE, which was their version of the CIA during World War II, they provided the model for many of these stay-behind networks.
This is starting to feel like this giant web of intrigue.
Yeah.
So many players, so many secrets, so many blurred lines. Where does Borghese fit into all of this?
He fits in quite snugly, I would say. Yeah, his involvement brings us to a name that's going to be central to our discussion today.
Okay.
Gladio.
Gladio.
It's like something out of a Roman epic.
It's a pretty apt name, considering the era and the players involved.
Right.
Gladio was the name given to the Italian branch of this stay-behind network.
And Borghese, with all his experience, his connections, he became a key figure in its development. And what's fascinating here is that Borghese's vision, it went beyond just fighting communism. He envisioned a united Europe, free from the constraints of nation states.
Yeah.
And fiercely opposed to communists.
Okay, so that's an idea that resonates with some pretty powerful currents of thought at the time. A united Europe, free from the divisions that led to 2 world wars, a strong anti-communist stance. I mean, it almost sounds like a precursor to the modern European Union, albeit one with a very different and much darker path in mind.
You're absolutely right. It's that Borghese, in some ways, he anticipated the trajectory of European integration, but through this very, very distinct lens of authoritarianism and clandestine operations.
So we have Borghese, this charismatic and ideologically driven figure at the helm of Gladio, the secret army operating in the shadows. But where does the violence come in? I mean, we started this deep dive talking about this wave of terror that swept across Europe during the Cold War.
Yeah.
Was Borghese involved in that?
He was. And his involvement brings us to one of the most chilling aspects of this whole story, the strategy of tension.
The strategy of tension. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it was a period marked by a series of bombings, massacres, assassinations across Italy, often blamed on communist groups.
Wow.
But with evidence that points to a much more complex and sinister origin.
So acts of terror designed to create fear and chaos. Why? Why would anyone do such a thing? What was the goal?
Well, the goal was to manipulate public opinion, to create a climate of fear and instability, and ultimately to kind of push the populace towards embracing a more authoritarian solution.
It's a terrifyingly cynical strategy, using fear and violence to manipulate people and to erode trust in democratic institutions. Are we saying that Borghese was directly involved in these acts of terror?
There's a lot of debate about the extent of his involvement.
Okay.
But one thing is clear. He was a key figure in the network that carried out these operations. And to understand his role, we need to take a closer look at a specific event, his attempted coup d'etat in 1970.
A coup. So Borghese, this former frogman turned Cold War operative,
Right.
actually tried to seize power in Italy.
He did.
Wow.
And it was a dramatic event. That almost changed the course of Italian history. So picture this Italy in 1970,
Yeah.
still kind of reeling from the war, grappling with all this political and economic
It
instability.
sounds like the perfect breeding ground for, extremist ideologies and movements.
Exactly, yeah, like a powder keg waiting to be ignited. And Borghese, with his military background and his network of, shall we say, extremist allies, he was just the man to strike a match.
And he did right. He tried to take over.
He did, yeah. On the night of December 7th, 1970, Borghese launched his coup.
Wow.
Yeah, he mobilized his supporters, he armed them, even had a statement prepared, ready to broadcast to the nation, announcing the seizure of power.
So he was ready to take over the country.
He was ready, and then at the last minute, the whole thing just fizzled out.
What?
Well,
What happened?
that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a mystery that still kind of haunts historians to this day. Some people think there was betrayal within his ranks.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, others suggest that his foreign sponsors, maybe those shadowy figures we've been talking about, got cold feet and pulled the plug.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It really does.
So what happened to Borghese after the failed coup? Was he, arrested, put on trial?
He managed to escape, fled to Spain, actually, found refuge under the protection of General Francisco Franco.
Oh, wow. Another dictator with a colorful past, to say the least.
You could say that. But even in exile, Borghese remained connected to that shadowy world of clandestine operations. And that brings us to another key player in this whole story, Agenter Press.
The Ginger Press. Who are they? I don't think I've heard that name before.
Think of them as a kind of mercenary organization for the far right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they were based in Portugal, which at the time was still under a dictatorship, and they specialized in covert operations, propaganda, and, well, terrorism.
Terrorism. Like actual acts of violence.
Yeah. They were implicated in a number of assassinations, bombings, other acts of violence, often targeting left-wing figures, liberation movements, anyone they perceived as a threat to their far-right ideology.
Wow. So they were like a death squad for hire, basically.
In a way, yeah. And they operated across Europe, Africa, even South America, leaving a trail of blood and chaos in their wake.
It's chilling to think that organizations like that existed, operating in the shadows, carrying out these acts of violence. And what about Borghese? Was he working with Agenter Press?
There's evidence to suggest that he maintained connections with them even while he was in exile. Remember Stefano Delci? Borghese's right-hand man.
Yeah.
He became the Italian representative for Agenter Press.
Okay, so even though he was forced to flee Italy, he never really left that world of clandestine operations and extremist ideology.
Exactly. And this connection to Agenter Press, it's a crucial piece of the puzzle because it highlights that international dimension of this story. We're not just talking about events happening in Italy. This network spans continents with operatives and collaborators in multiple countries.
It's like a giant web, isn't it?
It is.
With threads connecting individuals and organizations and events all across the globe. And at the center of it all, we have figures like Borghese pulling strings, influencing events, perpetuating this strategy of tension that you described earlier.
That's a great analogy. And to really understand the full scope of this strategy, we need to go beyond Gladio, beyond even Agenter Press. We need to talk about what some researchers call the parallel Gladio.
The parallel Gladio, another secret army.
It's even more clandestine than Gladio. Think of it as a network within a network, operating even deeper in the shadows, with even less accountability.
So you have Gladio, this officially sanctioned, though still secret, stay-behind army. And then you have this parallel Gladio operating alongside it, but with its own agenda, its own methods. What was the purpose of this parallel Gladio? What were they trying to achieve?
That's a question that investigators have been grappling with for decades, and we may never have all the answers.
No.
But the evidence suggests that this parallel Gladio was responsible for some of the most brutal and shocking acts of violence during this period.
We've already talked about the bombings and the massacres that were attributed to this strategy of tension. Are you saying that this parallel Gladio was behind some of those attacks?
There's strong evidence to suggest that they were, and one event in particular stands out. The kidnapping and murder of Aldo Moro in 1978.
Aldo Moro, he was the prime minister of Italy, right?
That's
His
right.
kidnapping was a huge national trauma.
Exactly. And the circumstances surrounding his death are still shrouded in mystery. Moro was abducted by the Red Brigades, a left-wing terrorist group.
Right.
He was held captive for 55 days, during which time the Italian government refused to negotiate with his captors. And then his body was found in the trunk of a car, riddled with bullets.
It's a horrific story, but how does this connect to the parallel Gladio? Are you suggesting that they were somehow involved in Moro's kidnapping and murder?
There are a number of intriguing details that point in that direction. For one, there's the location where Moro's body was found, Via Caetani, a street in Rome that's just a stone's throw from the headquarters of the Christian Democrats, Moro's political party.
So they dumped his body right in the heart of his own party's territory. It's like a message, isn't it?
Exactly. And then there's the timing of the kidnapping. It happened just as Moro was trying to bring the Communist Party into the Italian government, a move that would have significantly shifted the political landscape.
So are you saying that someone, perhaps those operating within this parallel Gladio, saw Moro's political maneuvering as a threat and decided to eliminate him?
It's a very plausible theory. And it's supported by a number of other details, including the fact that some of the weapons used in the kidnapping were traced back to Gladio.
Wait, weapons from the official stay-behind army were used in the kidnapping of the prime minister. That's a pretty huge connection.
It is.
How could something like that happen? Wouldn't there be an investigation? Wouldn't someone be held accountable?
That's where the true nature of this parallel Gladio becomes apparent. It was a network so deeply embedded within the state, so well protected by those in power, that it was virtually untouchable.
It's a chilling thought. A secret network, operating with impunity, carrying out acts of violence, manipulating events at the highest levels of government. You said that there were aristocratic families involved in all this.
Yes, that's another layer of this whole complex story. We've already talked about how the XMAS Frogmen unit was largely composed of aristocrats, including Borghese himself. But the connections go even deeper. There's evidence to suggest that some of the most powerful families in Italy were involved in both Gladio and this parallel Gladio, using their wealth, their influence, their connections to protect their interests and to shape the political landscape.
Aristocrats, secret armies, terrorism, political assassinations. It's all starting to sound like a conspiracy theory.
I know, it sounds
Oh.
unbelievable,
Hmm.
but it's all based on evidence, on historical research.
So it's not just speculation. There's actual proof that this network existed and that it was involved in these activities.
There is. And while some of the details are still debated, the overall picture is clear. There was a network of power operating in post-war Italy, a network that included former fascists, intelligence operatives, right-wing extremists, and even members of the aristocracy. And this network was involved in a campaign of violence and manipulation designed to influence the political landscape and to prevent the rise of communism.
It's incredible how much we're learning about the history of Italy and the Cold War in general. I mean, this is stuff that they don't teach you in school.
It's not exactly common knowledge, is it?
No, not at all. You mentioned the aristocracy being involved. What about other powerful institutions? Did the church have any role in this? What about the Vatican?
That's an excellent question. And it brings us to one of the most intriguing and controversial aspects of this whole story, the role of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, also known as the SMO, or the Knights of Malta.
The Knights of Malta. Wait, you mean that ancient order, the one with the castles and the knights in armor?
The very same.
I thought they were just a historical curiosity. You're saying they're involved in all of this, in this web of Cold War intrigue.
They were. And their involvement is one of the most fascinating and unsettling pieces of this whole puzzle. The SMO is a complex organization with a very long and complicated history. They're a sovereign entity recognized by over 100 countries, and they have a long tradition of humanitarian work. But they also have these deep ties to the Catholic Church, to the aristocracy, and, as we'll see, to intelligence networks.
So they're this ancient order with a humanitarian mission, but also with connections to power and influence that go back centuries. How did they get involved in this murky world of the Cold War and the strategy of tension?
That's a story that unfolds across continents. And it involves some of the most powerful figures of the 20th century. Remember Ellery Stone, the American officer who saved Borghese from execution? Well, he was a high-ranking member of the SMO. And so was James Jesus Angleton, the CIA figure we talked about earlier. In fact, a lot of key figures in the Anglo-American intelligence world were members of the SMO, suggesting a deep connection between this ancient order and the clandestine operations of the Cold War.
So we're seeing a convergence of, like, seemingly disparate worlds, the ancient traditions of the Knights of Malta, the shadowy world of Cold War intelligence, the violent extremism of figures like Borghese. It's it's hard to wrap your head around it all. What was the SMM's agenda? Why were they involved in this?
That's a question that historians and researchers are still debating. Some believe the SMO was simply a pawn in a larger game, used by powerful individuals like Angleton to advance their own agendas. Others see the SMOM as a more active player, with his own goals and ambitions, perhaps connected to the Synarchy movement we discussed earlier.
The Synarchy, that network of powerful individuals who want to restore the old world order.
Yes, are you saying the SOM might be connected to them?
It's a possibility. And to understand why, we need to go back in time, to the origins of the SMO, to the Crusades, to the world of medieval knights and religious fervor.
The SOM has always seen itself as a defender of the faith, a bulwark against the forces of darkness. And in the context of the Cold War, that meant fighting against communism, which they saw as a threat to Christian civilization.
So in their eyes, the fight against communism was a holy war, a continuation of the Crusades.
Exactly. And it helps to explain why the SOM might have been drawn into this world of clandestine operations and political intrigue. They saw themselves as fighting a spiritual battle, a battle for the soul of Europe, and they were willing to use whatever means necessary to achieve victory.
But weren't they a humanitarian organization? How do you reconcile that with their alleged involvement in these shadowy operations?
That's one of the paradoxes of the SM, isn't it? They have this genuine commitment to humanitarian work, and they've done a lot of good in the world. But they also have this history of political intrigue, a willingness to use their power and influence to achieve their goals. In the context of the Cold War, those goals aligned with those of the West, even if it meant resorting to methods that were, shall we say, morally questionable.
It's a complicated picture. An ancient order with this dual nature, humanitarian and yet also deeply involved in the world of power and politics. And their connection to figures like Borghese and Angleton raises some serious questions about their role in this strategy of tension.
It does. And to really understand the extent of their involvement, we need to delve into one particular incident. It really sheds light on their willingness to use force, to manipulate events. We need to talk about the LaRouche assassination
The
plot.
LaRouche assassination plot. Who was LaRouche? And why would the SMO want to assassinate him?
Linda LaRouche was an American economist and political activist who, back in the 1970s, became a vocal critic of the Anglo-American financial system.
Okay.
He advocated for a new economic order, one that he believed would be fairer, more equitable. He also became a target of the intelligence community, which saw him as a threat to the established order.
So he was an outsider, a critic of the system. And that made him a target. What does this have to do with the SMOM?
Well, in 1978, a plot was uncovered to assassinate LaRouche. And the evidence pointed to the SMO as being involved in the planning and coordination of this plot.
You're saying that the Knights of Malta, this ancient order with a humanitarian mission, were involved in a plot to kill an American economist. That's hard to believe.
I know it sounds crazy, but the evidence is there.
What was their motive? Why would they want to do such a thing?
There are a number of theories. Some believe that LaRouche's economic ideas were seen as a threat to the financial interests of those connected to the SMO. Others suggest that his political activism, his criticism of the establishment, was seen as a danger to the stability of the West.
So basically, he was rocking the boat too much for their comfort.
Yeah, you could say that. Whatever the reason, the LaRouche assassination plot provides a glimpse into the darker side of the SMO, their willingness to use force and to silence those they perceive as enemies.
It's a chilling story, and it raises some disturbing questions about the true nature of the SMO and their role in the events we've been discussing. So we have this ancient order allegedly involved in assassination plots connected to figures like Borghese and Angleton and potentially aligned with the goals of the Synarchy. It's a lot to take in.
It is. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It does. Where do we go from here? How do we make sense of this whole web of intrigue?
To understand the full scope of this story, we need to go back even further in time. We need to explore the historical roots of this network of power, trace its origins back to the very heart of Europe. We need to talk about the Venetian connection.
The Venetian connection. Are we talking about Venice? The city of canals and gondolas?
The one and only.
What does that have to do with all of this?
You might be surprised to learn that Venice, even centuries after its decline as a major power, still wielded considerable influence in the 20th century.
Really?
Yeah, and that influence played a key role in the events we've been discussing.
This is getting more and more intriguing. So how does Venice, the city of art and history, connect to the world of secret armies and terrorism and Cold War intrigue?
To answer that, we need to introduce a key figure, a man named Count Giuseppe Volpi di Misurata.
Count Giuseppe Volpi di Misurata. What a name.
It is, isn't it? He was a prominent Venetian businessman and politician, played a pivotal role in the rise of Benito Mussolini and the fascist movement in Italy.
So this Venetian count helped to bring Mussolini to power. That's a pretty significant connection. What was his motivation? Why would he support fascism?
Volpi, like many of the Venetian elite, was a staunch nationalist. He believed in the greatness of Italy, and he saw Mussolini as the man who could restore the country to its former glory. He also saw fascism as a bulwark against communism, which he viewed as a threat to the traditional order of Europe.
So we're seeing some familiar themes here. Nationalism, anti-communism, a desire to restore a bygone era.
Exactly. And Volpi wasn't the only one who had these views. There was a whole network of powerful families in Venice, families with long histories of wealth, influence, and political intrigue. They saw the rise of fascism as an opportunity to advance their own interests and to reshape Italy according to their vision.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster, a small group of powerful families with an agenda that's completely out of touch with the needs of the people, manipulating events to seize control.
That's precisely what happened. And the consequences were devastating, not just for Italy, but for the entire world. The rise of fascism led to World War II, a conflict that claimed millions of lives. And it shattered the old order of Europe.
It's a stark reminder of the dangers of concentrated power and unchecked ambition. But you're saying this Venetian network didn't just disappear after the war, they were still active during the Cold War.
They were. And their influence can be seen in the events we've been discussing. Remember Bernardino Nogara, the Vatican financier we talked about earlier?
Yeah, the guy who managed the Vatican's money.
That's the one. Well, he was a close associate of Volpi and a key figure in this Venetian network.
So this network had connections to the Vatican. That's a surprise. What was Nogara doing for the Vatican?
Nogara was a financial wizard. He was brought in to manage the Vatican's finances after the Lateran Treaty of 1929, which granted the Vatican city statehood and a large financial settlement from the Italian government.
So the Vatican suddenly had a lot of money to manage, and they turned to this Venetian financier to handle it for them. Interesting. But how does this connect to the larger story, the Cold War, the strategy of tension?
Nogara, through his connections to Volpi and the Venetian network, had access to a vast web of financial resources and political influence.
Ah, I see.
And he used this network to support the Vatican's anti-communist activities during the Cold War.
So the Vatican was actively involved in the fight against communism. I knew that they were opposed to it ideologically, but I didn't realize they were playing such an active role.
They were. And their involvement went beyond just, condemning communism from the pulpit. They were funding anti-communist organizations, supporting right-wing political parties, even engaging in clandestine operations.
Wow, this is all starting to feel very cloak and dagger. Secret armies, assassination plots, Vatican financing. It's like something out of a spy novel.
It is, isn't it? And the connections go even deeper. Nogara, through his financial dealings, had ties to some of the most powerful figures in the world, including the Rothschilds and the Morgans.
Wait, are we talking about the Rothschilds and the Morgans, the banking dynasties? They were involved in this too?
There's evidence to suggest that they were. And that brings us to another key figure in this Venetian network, a man named Michele Sindona.
Sindona, I've heard that name before. Wasn't he involved in some kind of financial scandal?
He was. Sindona was an Italian banker, had close ties to the Vatican, to the mafia, and to the parallel Gladio.
Wow, what a combination.
Right. He was a master manipulator. He moved vast sums of money through this complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts, and he used his financial power to support the activities of the parallel Gladio and to advance the agenda of the Venetian network.
So we're seeing this convergence of organized crime, Vatican finances, and Cold War clandestine operations. It's a truly disturbing picture, and you're saying that this Sindona was at the center of it all.
He was, and his story is a tragic one. In the end, his empire crumbled, his schemes were exposed, and he was murdered in prison, poisoned with cyanide.
It's a fitting end, I suppose, for a man who lived a life of deception and manipulation.
Yeah.
But his story is a reminder that this network of power was real, it was dangerous, and it had its tentacles in some of the highest institutions in the world.
It does, and it raises some pretty uncomfortable questions about how much of what we perceive as history is actually the product of these hidden agendas and clandestine operations.
It's a lot to think about. We've gone from, like, Nazi frogmen to Cold War conspiracies, from the streets of Rome to the canals of Venice, and from the heights of aristocratic power to the depths of organized crime. And it seems like all these threads are connected, woven together into this tapestry of intrigue and manipulation that has shaped the course of history.
It has. And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, we'll try to untangle some of these threads and try to answer the question that's been looming over our entire discussion. Who are the real puppet masters? Who are the hidden forces that have been shaping our world?
Man, what a journey this has been.
Right.
From Mussolini's Italy to the Cold War, we've
Yeah.
uncovered this whole web of like clandestine operations, extremist ideologies, this shadowy network of power that just seems to stretch across, continents and centuries.
It does, yeah, a lot of moving parts. But when you take a step back and look at the big picture, I think a pretty clear pattern emerges.
Right.
You see a consistent effort to manipulate events, to influence political outcomes, to maintain control.
Yeah, you're talking about the strategy of tension again, this whole idea of using fear and chaos to shape public opinion and to justify authoritarian measures. But who's behind it all? I mean, we've talked about so many different groups, Gladio, Ginterpress, the SMOM, even this Venetian network. It's hard to keep track of, like, who's who
Yeah.
and what their motivations are.
Yeah, it's complicated. But you have to remember, these groups, they're not always working in isolation.
Mm.
They often have overlapping memberships, shared goals, and they're definitely willing to cooperate when it suits their interests.
So they're like different parts of the same machine, each playing a specific role in achieving this larger objective.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But what is that objective? I mean, what are they ultimately trying to achieve?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's no easy answer. But we can look for clues in their ideologies, in their actions,
Yeah.
And what we see is this consistent theme of anti-communism, a desire to preserve the traditional order of Europe, and this willingness to use whatever means necessary to achieve those goals.
Yeah, you mentioned the synarchy earlier. This movement that seeks to restore the power of, the old oligarchies, the families, the financial institutions that ruled Europe before the rise of, nation states and democracy.
Right.
Do you think that's like what's driving all of this?
It's definitely a possibility. The Synarchy, it's not this like monolithic organization,
Yeah.
with a clearly defined membership or like a written manifesto. It's more of an ideology, a way of seeing the world,
I see.
a belief that power should be concentrated in the hands of a select few. And that belief is shared by a lot of the individuals and organizations we've been talking about.
So they might not be like, consciously coordinating their actions, but they're all kind of working towards the same end.
Exactly.
A return to a world where power is concentrated in the hands of, an elite few.
Yeah. And the strategy of tension is one of the tools they use to achieve that goal.
Right.
Creating a climate of fear and instability. That way they can justify cracking down on dissent, limiting civil liberties, and ultimately eroding public trust in democratic institutions.
Man, it's a chilling thought. But if this synarchy movement is so powerful, so influential,
Yeah.
why haven't we heard more about them? Why are they operating in the shadows like this?
Well, because they thrive in the shadows.
Okay.
They understand that real power lies in secrecy, in manipulation, in pulling the strings behind the scenes. They don't need to be in the spotlight. They're content to influence events from the sidelines, just kind of nudge things in the direction they want them to go.
It's like a puppeteer controlling the strings, but remaining hidden from you.
Exactly.
But even the most skilled puppeteer needs a stage,
Yeah.
like a setting where they can operate. And it seems like post-war Italy provided the kind of perfect backdrop for these shadowy forces to work their magic.
You're absolutely right. Italy, in the aftermath of World War II,
Yeah.
it was a country in turmoil, struggling to rebuild its economy, heal its political divisions, trying to find its place in this, rapidly changing world.
Mm-hmm.
It was fertile ground for extremism,
Right.
for those who sought to exploit the chaos and the uncertainty to advance their own agendas.
And Borghese, with his military background, his charisma, his network of, extremist allies,
Yeah.
he was the perfect front man for these forces.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
he was a charismatic leader, a skilled manipulator, and definitely someone who was willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals.
He was. And his story, I think, is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the allure of power, and the seductive nature of extremist ideologies.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about the dark side of this story, the violence, the manipulation, these shadowy networks operating behind the scenes. But there's also like a message of hope here, isn't there?
I think so, yeah. I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation, that we're able to even shine a light on these hidden forces, it's a sign that we're not powerless.
Yeah.
We can resist their influence, we can expose their secrets, and we can build a world where power is accountable, where justice prevails,
Yeah.
and where the voices of the people are heard.
So what can we do? Like what steps can we take to counter these shadowy forces, to prevent, the strategy of tension from becoming the dominant force in our world?
Well, first and foremost, I think we need to be aware. We need to understand the tactics that are being used,
Okay.
the patterns of manipulation that are being employed, the ideologies that are driving these actions.
The knowledge is power.
Exactly. Yeah. The more we know about how these networks operate, the better equipped we'll be to resist their influence.
Right. Makes sense.
And we also need to be critical thinkers. We need to question the narratives that we're being told, challenge the assumptions that are being made, demand evidence to support the claims that are being put forward.
So it's about being informed, being engaged, and being willing to speak truth to power.
It is, yeah. And it's also about supporting those who are working to expose these networks, to hold them accountable, and to build a better world. You know,
Yeah.
there are journalists, researchers, activists, politicians even, who are fighting for transparency, for justice, for a future where power is used for good, not for personal gain or for the advancement of these narrow ideologies.
So it's not about giving in to despair or to cynicism.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we have agency, that we have a voice, and that we can make a difference.
Exactly. The story of Junio Valerio Borghese, the Black Prince of post-war Italy, it's a reminder that the forces of darkness, they're always at work.
Yeah.
But also a reminder that we have the power to resist them, to expose their secrets, and to build a brighter future.
Well, that's a powerful message to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into this murky world of post-war Italy.
It was my pleasure.
We hope you found it, informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Yeah.
So until next time, keep those critical thinking skills sharp and always, always question the narrative.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening, everyone.